Thank you all very much. It's always a pleasure to come back to Cambridge and to the environs of Harvard. However, whenever I do, I remember, it was a long time ago, that I was briefly courted by Harvard as a possible student in the fall of 1958. It was that geographic distribution that they were beginning to think about. I was growing up out in the Great Plains, and there were 6 of us who were recruited from South Dakota that particular year. 2 came, the rest of us went off on our separate ways. So as I often like to tell Harvard audiences when I come here, either at the Kennedy School or when I'm lecturing, I'm one of those poor souls who has been forced to wander through life without a Harvard degree, wondering what success I might have become if I'd only had a Harvard degree. A couple of years ago, I was a judge in a journalistic competition. Kind of the Livingston Awards are kind of the Pulitzers for young journalists. And there had been a long series in the Boston Globe about grade inflation at Harvard. And on the day that we were giving the award to the young man who wrote that series at this award ceremony, we were also honoring Bill Buckley and his son Christopher, proud graduates, of course, of Yale. And when we finished the award to this young man who'd written about grade inflation at Harvard, I looked at Bill Buckley and thought, I know how I can please him. And I said, this explains why so many Harvard graduates we meet are not as smart as we think that they should be. And it made Bill Buckley glow with a great smile as a Yale graduate. I thought I would just take a little bit of your time before I take your questions and tell you how I came to write this book. Some of it had to do with my age and the place that we are in America at the beginning of the 21st century. I was born in 1940, so my first memories of life were of World War II and what a defining event that was. And of course, I was so young I didn't fully comprehend the consequences. But later, I came to write about it as I described the greatest generation that survived the Depression, won that war, came home, and gave us the lives that we have today. And then at the age that I am now, I've entered a new phase. I'm a grandparent. And my generation, and especially the boomers who came along shortly after, we thought we were forever young. I'm not sure that we were absolutely prepared for the idea of being grandma and grandpa. In fact, what I've discovered, and I've been keeping track of this, my contemporaries and friends and others that I've encountered really try to find a way to avoid that nomenclature. They love being a grandparent. They're not crazy about being called grandpa and grandma. My favorite story involves a man who's a very successful real estate developer in Manhattan, about my age. He married a much younger woman and saw himself as kind of a dashing swashbuckler in Manhattan. And then his daughter came to him and said, I'm pregnant and I'm going to have a boy. And he was overjoyed, but he said to her, I don't want to be called granddad or grandpa. My name is Ben. I'll be a very good grandfather, but I want this child to call me Ben. So the baby was born, and they quickly bonded. And then when the baby boy got to be about 3.5 and was in preschool, there was Grandparents' Day. So Ben went to Grandparents' Day. The little boy was playing over in the corner, and he looked up and he said, Ben, what are you doing here? And Ben looked over at him and said, it's Grandfather's Day. I'm your grandfather. And the kid said, you are? I think it sums it up in so many ways. In our case, when our first grandchild was born, my wife said, well, they'll call me Nan, which was the endearing term that she used for her maternal grandmother, and they can call you Grandpa. And I said, no, well, we're going to work on this a little bit. I was helped in part because my grandchildren were living some distance from New York City, and they saw me a lot on television, so they just call me Tom wherever we are. And it works out fairly well. But there is an adjustment to all of that, obviously, because they're so much more sophisticated now in the way they travel and the kinds of education that they have and how they work on the internet. It never came to me with greater clarity than when I was with my San Francisco granddaughters. We were in Hawaii on the beach one Christmas, and they were at that point about 8 and 6. And the three of us had gone down to the beach on our own. And I could see the waitress coming along the beach, and I'm trying to think, what am I going to do? How do I order for them? Before I get a word out, my 8-year-old granddaughter said, "We'd like 2 virgin pina coladas, please. Tom, will you join us in this?" And I knew the relationship was different. But apart from those kind of joyful moments, I have looked at these grandchildren with a new kind of intensity and I dare say some anxiety, wondering what kind of life that they'll have. Moreover, I'm wondering what they'll say about our legacy 50 years from now, about the kind of life that we created for them and the world that we left for them. Wherever I go in America in recent years, I'm hearing a question that I had never heard before. Parents of my age and younger are coming up to me and saying, "I'm so worried that my children won't have the lives that we've had." That addresses an essential part of the American dream. And so I've been trying to go around the country and recalibrate that question some, because it's almost framed in an unspoken way with, will they make more money than I did, or have a larger house, or more cars, or more toys, or be able to travel more? And I have been suggesting to parents that we probably ought to retool the expectations along qualitative lines and not just quantitative lines. How do we make this a more just society? How do we fix our broken educational system in America so everyone has an opportunity for a job in a global economy? How do we make sure that we expand racial and gender tolerance and opportunity across America? And most of all, how do we fit in as a society on a smaller planet with so many more people? Because the assumptions that we've had in the past no longer are as applicable as they once were. And as I looked at my granddaughters in New York and in San Francisco, and when we get together on family occasions, that began to resonate not just as a grandfather, but also as a citizen and as a journalist. And then 2 years ago at our ranch in Montana, my mother came to visit us and spent time. She was quite arthritic at that point and in her 90s. And she was a living, walking reminder of how much America had been through before we got to the 21st century and how much she had gone through in her own life. A child of the Great Depression whose farm was blown away, had to move to town so she could take a job for $1 a day. Her great hopes of going to college were dashed because it cost $100 a year. Married my father, who had dropped out of school at the age of 10 to become a construction worker first and then a master of operating heavy construction equipment. And they had a working class life of great values and no whining and no whimpering. A great determination that their oldest son, me, would be the first in our family to go to college, and that they would save something out of every salary. Both my mother and father worked, and they would measure their lives by prudence and by fundamental values. I say in this book there's a big debate these days about American exceptionalism, about those who believe in it and those who have doubts. I have no doubts. I believe in it. But I believe in it in a way that I was raised. I believe that patriotism means love your country, but always believe that it can be improved, because that was always the kind of unspoken belief in our family. And it's worked out pretty well through the generations. So now I'm trying to raise questions that we ought to be thinking about and addressing. I suppose this book really began for me in the spring of 2009 when I was in Dresden, Germany, waiting to interview President Obama as he was heading for the 65th anniversary of Normandy. I had just come from those beaches, and I was doing them live on the Friday before the ceremonies for the Today Show and then for Nightly News. And as I stood there in Dresden, I remembered, of course, that it had been leveled in the closing days of World War II by firebombing by the Allies. This great, great city of extraordinary Central European treasures was now beginning to rebuild itself again because it had lived the last 40 years behind the communist wall. And I was waiting to see our first African-American president. I'd been a reporter in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, one of the most exciting and profoundly important moments in my life that I'll ever cover, but I had no expectations that by the beginning of the 21st century we will have elected an African American as president of this country. And he was on his way to Normandy, where the greatest military invasion in the history of mankind had occurred. But before he did that, he was going with Angela Merkel to Buchenwald, one of the great moral failings of mankind that anyone could possibly imagine. Angela Merkel, so many people are not fully aware, had walked across from East Germany to West Germany the night the wall came down. I was the only reporter who was there that night, so it was a memorable occasion for me. She'd been a lab technician in East Germany. Now here was this woman who was the chancellor of a united Germany. When I said to the president when he arrived, I said, I've just come from Berlin, such a vibrant cosmopolitan city, and what an extraordinary story about how it has risen from the ashes of World War II and the shame and the outrage of Nazism. I said, I was there the night the wall came down. I was the only correspondent. I just got lucky. And he said, oh, I remember, Tom. I was in law school at the time. And I thought, oh my God, he was in law school. I walked away from that interview mindful of the seismic changes that had occurred just in my lifetime and the extraordinary challenges that this country and other countries around the world had to meet, and how we are such a realigned globe now. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the liberation of Eastern Europe, the rise of China, which for most of our lives, of the people in this room, was kind of a spot on the map that said, beyond here serpents lie. When I first went to China in the mid-1970s, it might as well have been the Stone Age in that country. Now it's not just the 21st century country, it's the 22nd century country in so many ways. So I began to write about what I thought we should be thinking about. And I tried to encourage in this book a conversation across partisan ideological lines, across geographic boundaries in America, across class lines, to see if we can't work out some means that we can have a new political and social culture in which we listen more and shout less, in which we determine what we need to do to reach common ground, honorable objectives that will advance this precious place forward. And it was not easy when you set out on a journey like that, because there are no roadmaps. And what I relied on was my own experience as a journalist, as a son of working class parents, as someone who, in a way, won the lottery in American life in terms of the career that I've been able to have, and the exceptional good fortune that I've had in my personal life, having been married almost a half century now to a wonderful woman that I met when I was 15, and looked at my daughters, who were highly educated, have traveled the world with great ease, and they're making real contributions to society, not just here in their professional lives, but in their personal commitments in working with refugees in Haiti and Thailand and around the world. And I thought, how do we maintain the essence of that American experience, that unique productivity of this immigrant place, which has always been best when it's more than the sum of its parts. So I've come up with a phrase that I use when I go before groups like this and others. I say that I think it's time for us to re-enlist as citizens, to step forward, because these are not imagined challenges, they're real. And the way I begin that kind of call to arms in many settings is to remind everyone that while we're here at this beautiful Unitarian church in Cambridge or across America, gathered to have a discussion about commerce or politics or just gossiping, in distant lands, young Americans, men and women, who are mostly from the middle class and almost entirely from the working class, are putting on Kevlar helmets and vests and goggles and locking and loading weapons. They represent less than 1% of the American population. They're taking 100% of the bullets and the wounds and the deaths. That's not just unjust, it's immoral. So that's a place that I suggest in my book and in my other appearances that we begin to think about how we knit each other back together again. I have some thoughts about how we can do that, but it really begins at the personal level. If in your community or your workplace or wherever you happen to be, that you make an extra effort to reach out to those families, however you feel about these wars. And I have grave doubts about the militarization of America's presence in the world, but it's not the fault of these warriors and the young people who are coming home with these broken bodies, physically and psychologically. That's a place to begin, because that's a place that we can almost all agree on, that we should be knit together and not have a separation between a civilian society that pays no attention whatsoever to the war and the consequences of it, and 1% of the population in uniform and bearing the entire burden. And then finally, I work my way back to the place of my relationship with my grandchildren and how it's rewarding in ways I could not have expected every day. I suspect that there are more than a few grandparents in the audience. I have just one kind of operating, I suppose, piece of wisdom that has helped me a lot. About 2 years after they were born, when they were getting to the age where they could respond to who we were and what we were about, I turned to my wife and I said, you know, when we were parents, bribery was a white-collar crime. As a grandparent, it's a business plan. So with that, let me just say I'd be happy to take your questions. Full range, not just about my book, but about American politics these days, about journalism, because I'm touching on all of that in the book itself, about values, about proportion, about education. So I'd be happy to hear from you, and if you don't have a question, if you have an answer, I'd be grateful for that as well. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, Mr. Brokaw.
Is that microphone on? Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Brokaw. It's really a great honor to hear you and to see you in person. And my whole life, you've just been a part of it, and I'm just deeply honored to actually be standing here in front of you. I myself have traveled all over the world myself, obviously not nearly to the extent that you have, but I've lived in India, I've lived in Hungary, I've lived in South America. And I also see that the state of America is really pitiful. One, and I find that really interesting, you're saying how about there's just 1% that's out there putting on the Kevlar vests, and that we have to start at the bottom. But I think from what you're saying, it seems like the problem is really that this whole sort of military thing, like, you know, I mean, of course we love the military and we respect the people who defend our country, but it's sort of been sort of romanticized to this degree where then it's sort of used as sort of a piece, like you sell this romantic ideal and then you have these people go off and have their legs and arms and heads like all screwed up when they come back. And how do you then go about talking to the families like, look, this is really screwed up, and I mean, how do we start?
Well, let me try to take a shot at that. You know, I don't think that we had an adequately robust debate about going to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, because there was still the residue of 9/11 that was playing out across the country that played with a lot of emotions. There was so much that was unknown. I had been in Iraq 3 times before the war began, and I had some grave reservations because I saw how broken the country was, how divided it was, how fractious it was, how divided by tribes it was, and I didn't think it was going to be easy once you get through the first 100 days of trying to put it back together again. But what I didn't know, and the UN inspectors that I went in with on one occasion didn't know either, is whether or not he had weapons of mass destruction. That was just kind of unknowable at that time. There were some doubts, but given his behavior in the past, we didn't know. Was that justification for the war? Others can make a conclusion about that. But I did know that the war would be long and expensive. I also felt that we had gone to the wrong place at the wrong time. We should have been in Afghanistan first. That's where the bad guys came from. And I also knew the long history of Afghanistan. You want to get in and get out as quickly as possible after you get your military objectives in mind. I've talked to the former CIA agent who ran the early stages of the war, which was the most successful piece of the war, and I've talked to Stan McChrystal, who was the best commanding general that we had in Afghanistan until he got in trouble with comments that were printed in the Rolling Stone. They both say the same thing. We just never had a keen appreciation of what was going on in that culture and how difficult it is. It's the most hostile geography you can imagine in the world. But in the course of my coverage of those two places, and I was embedded with the Special Forces in the 10th Mountain Division, I came back, and I write about this in the book, saying that we really do have to lower the profile of the military face of America in the world and raise the civilian face. So I have proposed in this book 6 public service academies attached to land-grant colleges across the country, 3-year courses, and I make it a public-private partnership. I'm really just trying to kickstart a conversation here. So you have the Caterpillar Fellow in construction, you have the John Deere Fellow in agriculture, the Johnson & Johnson Fellow in medicine, not just a doctor, but practitioners and technicians. And you use those people to be the face of America and to win hearts and minds and what they call soft power. They're also on duty here at home when you have Katrina or the Joplin tornado in Missouri. Because there's a longing across the country to have our public service programs be more than they are now. There are some great ones, AmeriCorps, the Teach for America, the Peace Corps, but they're just kind of off the radar screen. And I think we need big, bold ideas so that we can compete internationally and also continue to win friends and win their hearts and minds. We do exceptional work around the world that goes with too little recognition. This coming Wednesday night, the Brokaw family is very flattered to be honored by the International Rescue Committee, which is the IRC, does the kind of gold standard of refugee assistance around the world. Big in Sudan right now, in Somalia with what's going on. We've been very big in Afghanistan. I'm on the board of overseers. My daughter, Jennifer, an ER physician, worked for him. And my wife, Meredith, has done work for him as well and has a microfinance project in Malawi. But we need to raise the visibility of this kind of work, and one of the ways that we need to do it is, I think, to make it more institutionalized so young people see an opportunity to serve, get real skills while they're doing it. The private sector gains from it as well because they get a worker who can go off to native lands and speak the language and come back after 3 years of serving and then has a 2-year stint in the sponsoring company to prove himself or herself, and then they're on to something else. We're not going to have the draft come back to America. The military is not interested. It's politically not viable. It's very hard to come up with another idea for a national public service program of some kind. So as I say, I'd like to have the different fellowships, GE Fellow in water generator systems, and not just the Johnson & Johnson Fellow, but the Merck Fellow in pharmaceuticals, the Donald Trump Fellow in hairstyling. I mean, you make the decision about what you want. But I do think that we have to have a bold idea and begin this century by trying to answer John Kennedy's memorable question, what have you done for your country? Ask not what the country has done for you.
Evening, Mr. Brokaw. As a young, inspiring journalist, what is your advice to someone going into the broadcast journalism field with all your experience and stuff like that?
Now, let's go back and try that again. And just, let's have a beginning, middle, and end to the question, okay?
Just, I guess, for someone going into journalism, what's your advice to someone?
What is my take on journalism?
Yes.
Essentially, okay. Well, I describe the current climate and culture of journalism as the second Big Bang because of the impact of technology. We have created a whole new universe out there. And you find these planets that are colliding with each other or drifting too close to the sun and burning up. We're trying to decide which ones support life and you can count on them, which ones don't. I will say this in kind of shorthand. there is a richer menu of information available to us than we've ever had in our lifetime. Most people come up to me and say, I can't stand what's going on. And I said, then don't watch. You don't have to watch the people that you don't agree with. There's a lot more opinion than there's ever been in the past. But if you get beyond that and you're proactive as a consumer, you can go to the internet right now, at this moment, on a wireless in this room, and access tomorrow morning's edition of the Financial Times from London, for example, and get a great read on what's going on with the euro and stability in the European Union. Or you can call up the web page from the Council of Foreign Relations and get both contemporaneous and long-term reads on where we're going internationally, what's happening in China. You can read from Xinhua, which is a Chinese news agency that is now published in English, or Al Jazeera. But you have to work harder at it. You can't just be a couch potato and pick the paper off the porch in the morning, watch a little bit of the Today Show, go home at night, see the evening news, and maybe catch the late news and listen to a little radio in between. You're being bombarded. I understand that. I have a woman who is at our ranch in Montana. It's pretty apolitical, but she comes to me about twice a week, wide-eyed, and says, you're not going to believe what I read on the internet. And I always say to her, you're right, I'm not going to believe what you read on the internet. We have to develop individual filtration systems. What's reliable, what's not, what holds up, what doesn't. But if you do that, there's an exceptional range of sources for getting to what you need to know. There's a lot of investigative reporting going on now on the internet. There's a wonderful site called Politico that's kind of it's a quick snap read about what's happened overnight. I likened it in the book, frankly, to the old three-dot form of journalism, what you had with Herb Cain in San Francisco or Walter Winchell. This is a guy who's pulling together, giving you links to everything that's going on. You can read speeches and get the latest campaign contributions. It's an exceptional tip sheet that's available to you every morning with just a keystroke. So we just have to work harder at it.
Good evening, Mr. Brokaw. My name's Raymond, and I'm only 17 years old. I haven't seen much of this world yet, but from what I understand and what I am seeing, what I'm learning from journalists and yourself in particular, that this world it essentially needs a drastic change, but from what I've been seeing on the news, it's that this change it seems to be it seems to require a lot. It needs cooperation and conformity. I just want to know what your opinion is on if this cooperation can ever be achieved, I suppose.
Well, let me give you a little hope. We've never had more free people making free choices about their lives ever in the history of mankind than we do now. When the Soviet Union collapsed and democracies took hold in Eastern Europe, it's been imperfect up to this point, or in the stands as they're called. What's going on in China doesn't mean that they have free choice yet, but they have economic opportunity in some ways, and at some point they're going to have to make a decision about how they handle their political system. If you look across what's going on in Central and South America, we've had more free elections in the last 10 years than we've had in the contemporary history of that part of the world. We also have a global economy in which you can go to so many other places and find real prosperity. There's still too much emerging market poverty going on, and there are too many places like Somalia or Yemen, or too many overcrowded countries as well. So there is real hope. But we've always been the beacon for unification and having a kind of ideal. We're the greatest democratic republic in the planet, and a lot of people want to emulate us. A lot of people still want to come here. So we have to think, what kind of an obligation does that bring with it? How do we model ourselves? How do we present democracy to the world? What we have going on right now, for example, if you're a young student of democracy in Czechoslovakia or one of the reasonably new democracies in that part of the world, you look at what we have happening here and you wonder, 50% participation in elections, $2 billion spent on the election when the presidential term comes around. How can they be the continuing beacon? And we're the only ones that can change that. And my suggestion is that we have to step forward. Whatever you think about the Tea Party, they played by the rules. They got angry, they got organized, they got to Washington, they stayed on message. They have power way out of proportion to their numbers. But it's because they got organized and they formed a coalition and they're more than the sum of their parts. So we're counting on you to make life easier for me. So I can go sit in the old anchorman's rest home with a kind of a lap robe and a sip cup, you know, and then you'll come by and tell me that you've solved a lot of these problems, okay? Thank you very much.
Mr. Brokaw, I'm a high school student and I'm worried by the time my generation grows up, there won't be any benefits like Social Security or Medicare. What do we do now to make sure that there is Social Security and Medicare?
That's a very good question, and it's something that I've been talking a lot about, including today, because I was disappointed in the AARP ad that's been running on television in which they came out and said, "We vote, don't cut our benefits, because we'll remember you at election time." So I had a conversation today with the leadership of the AARP, and they're frustrated because they're not being included in any of the discussion in the deficit committees. But I said, what if you had retooled that ad and said, we're the AARP, we're 50 million seniors. A lot of our people depend on Social Security for everyday living. Others have more resources. We'd like to be part of the dialogue because we know reforms are required. In its current state, Social Security and Medicare are not financially sustainable. But we have everyday experience with it. Let us join in the debate. I think that would have had an entirely different kind of impact on the country. And the AARP is very sensitive to what their position and where their place is, so they're going to have, I think, a new campaign about civility in these debates and that kind of thing. What will happen, I suspect, is that we'll have, for the current recipients, we'll keep the benefits that they now have, but we're going to have to reform dramatically, Medicare especially, about the services, how much is spent, because people are living longer, medical technology costs a lot more, and it's just not sustainable. I happen to believe that people who've gotten lucky like I have should have it means tested in some fashion, or even opt out of it, continue to make contributions to Medicare, but make other arrangements through private carriers. I think that would probably help. I say to a lot of my friends who have done well in life, and they're always telling me about what procedure they've had done with Medicare, and I say, you know, come on, you've got coverage, you can go back and do it. There's a doctor in New York who's a real specialist, and he gets very angry because he's very interested in healthcare reform, and he said, the wealthiest people in America live in my zip code. And they come to me and they say, Doc, I just want you to do what Medicare covers. You've got to get beyond that. And it's going to be forced by the numbers and also by how you vote. That will help change it. Okay?
Hi there, Tom. How you doing? I figured I'd inject a little of my Boston Irish jargon here. Listen, as we all know, we have a huge budget deficit, but I believe more importantly, we have an empathy deficit. And in some respects, I think that our compassion has been surgically removed. So as you alluded to earlier, how do we re-enlist our citizens to help care again?
Well, I think that we've concentrated, in fact, a little narrowly on how we deal with the deficit and debt reduction. I honestly believe that the deficit, if it came with a kind of toxic smell and a hot wind attached to it, people would be feeling more urgent about it. But those who have jobs and are okay, get up in the morning, they don't worry about it a lot because it's not affecting them. But it's sitting out there and it's growing larger every day. Here are a couple of ways that we need to deal with it. I could take 2 chief petty officers from the Navy, 2 sergeant majors from the Army, also from the Air Force, and say to them, come back to me in 10 days and show me how we can save 5% in the defense budget. And they would have a long list in which they could do that. I could go into the tax code and say, this is crazy. We can't have all these loopholes and deductions and this complicated procedure that requires law firms that make a specialty of trying to keep corporations from paying a full short, or even people who have the resources to hire those kinds of law firms. We've got to change the tax code in this country so that it's more efficient, it's more fair, and it's more transparent for everyone so they understand what they're doing. Now let me get to something else. Massachusetts is just an example, but it's one of 50. The state of Massachusetts and its state government, as it's currently constructed, is wildly inefficient, as every other state is. The state government was put together at the turn of the 20th century when people were driving horses and buggies to town, and then patronage grew up. I actually asked your governor when I was doing a little research on this about one thing that he could change in Massachusetts very quickly in which they could save a fair amount of money. And he said 9/11 call centers. I can't remember the number. I think you've got like 25 or something in Massachusetts across the state. Southern California, which has about 28 million people, has 2 because they all go into a central location and then they go out on a digital basis to the local community so they can make a quick response. Much more efficient, much less expensive. So there are a lot of ways to do it. And it's not just about health care. But when it comes to health care, by the way, which is separate from Medicare and from Social Security, that discussion, of all the plans that have been played out so far and all the criticism of President Obama's, which is, I think, too complex and it made too many political bargains for people to be happy about it. I've yet to hear a plan that reduces that 17.5% number that health care represents in our GDP. We've got to get that down. So I think there's got to be greater emphasis on wellness. There's got to be greater emphasis on transparency and how much things cost. And there has to be a real examination of treatment at the end of life, because so much of our money is going for the end of life stuff. My mother is 93 and she's dying. And it's okay. She's had a great life. She's very comfortable where she is. She knows what's going on. I have resources. My daughter's an ER physician and an authority on end of life. It's still extraordinarily complex about the decisions that have to be made, about the procedures that she should have to undergo or not undergo, about the kind of care that she gets at home. So this is a debate and a discussion that we should have in this country, because it's not just about the price of it, it's emotional well-being for the families. They don't know how to deal with it, and with good reason. In Oregon, there are statistics that show that if a patient, an elderly person, begins to have a conversation with his or her primary care physician toward the end of their life and says, I want to die at home. I don't want to come into the hospital and have heroic procedures just to give me another 2 weeks or another month. They live longer and die happier than people who go into the hospital with their families saying, do whatever you can to keep grandma alive. These are invasive procedures, extraordinarily expensive, and they really go to the bottom line of healthcare in America. So we ought not to be afraid about talking about that. But that's just a very good example of the discussions that we need to have. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
In recent years, things like Twitter and blogs have increasingly called into question the role of a professional journalist and the idea of journalism as a profession, like being a doctor or a lawyer, because suddenly everybody with an internet connection is a citizen journalist.
Right.
So how do you think the internet has changed the role of professional journalism, and has that change been positive or negative?
Well, I don't represent a perfect profession. There's no question about that. And journalism and how you get the news is changing dramatically and will continue to change. But we're adapting to that. We're seeing these websites that are either attached to the newspaper or standalone. Twitter really is an instrument of early alert systems. You know, when Mumbai happened, even the first word that we got that Osama bin Laden had been killed was somebody tweeting from his neighborhood in Pakistan. But it's not really long form or even short form journalism. It's kind of, hey, pay attention kind of journalism. What the internet has done and what blogging has done is given voice to some people that we would not have otherwise heard in this country. A lot of them are very wise and have got something to say. But it's also become an instrument of a kind of destructive malice to go after somebody and to make up whatever you need to do, because we still haven't learned to deal with this phenomenon. It goes back to that woman I was talking about who said, you won't believe what I saw on the internet today. I had a recent experience with it. This is very small beer, small change, and this happens in one form or another a lot. But I said on the air that I was stunned by that ad that Herman Cain had with his campaign manager ending up with a cigarette. I'm a very strong, very passionate opponent of smoking in America. I've lost 12 friends to lung cancer. So I said, I now know what 99 stands for. 9 months to live with lung cancer, 9 months to live with emphysema, 9 months to live with coronary artery disease. I said that on Meet the Press. It triggered a whole line of bloggers saying Brokaw's a pansy, he never went after Obama about his smoking. In fact, I did. I wrote about Obama smoking when he took office in the New York Times. I've asked him about it. But you never catch up to that. It's out there, it's kind of permanently encased. If somebody were to Google Brokaw and smoking, all that blogging would come up. We now have our congressional and Senate offices spending a lot of effort with their staff monitoring what is being said every day and trying to respond to special interests. But it's up to you to develop a filtration system for it. And probably, I've actually talked to the Google people about this. Larry Page came to me a couple of years ago and said, what if we developed a site in which you could just respond to what was written about you? I said you would never be able to manage the amount of stuff that would come in, and then you'd have legal consequences as well. But there probably is room for what Bill Clinton calls safe haven, so that you can go and find out a fact checker on a regular basis, because he worries about the atomizing, as he calls it, of society. Okay?
Good evening, Mr. Brokaw. You speak so highly of American exceptionalism and say that you are a steadfast supporter in the belief of that ideal. And I'm 16 years old, and I'm going to grow up in a world where I believe China will become a major superpower and will hold great significance as far as economic influence goes and political as well. And I believe they're rising steadily to that position. Where do you see America's relations with China in the future as far as our position is concerned and their position is concerned?
Well, it's work in progress. We're working it out. One of the people that I know who knows China best, who's been there a lot, I've been there a fair amount, but I wouldn't call myself an utter authority. And this man has done a lot of business there. He's a keen student of China. And he said it is astonishing how much progress that country has made. They still don't know what they don't know. And they have huge problems that are coming online. They're going to have 400 million people moving into the cities in the next couple of years. People who want jobs, houses with utilities, cars, and all the accoutrements that come with Western consumer life. That's an enormous challenge. The biggest challenge I think that they have is how do they retain political control over that country, because they can crack down all they want on the internet and access to it. But right now, as you and I are talking about this, there are an untold number of young Chinese hacking in and getting access to what they want to have. We have to have a relationship with them. There's no question about that. I think that we ought to have it a little more on even terms, and that's our fault. You know, they own a lot of our debt, but we're the ones who got in debt. You know, we put ourselves in their hands. The most unsettling comment that was made to me by a brilliant young Chinese economist about a year and a half ago in New York was, at the end of a long and felicitous dinner, he looked at me and smiled and said, Mr. Brokaw, we're coming and you're leaving. And if that isn't a wake-up call, I don't know what is. So we have to work that out. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. I mean, there's been a lot of talk, especially in politics these days, about the kind of the decisive, or excuse me, how divided we are as a nation, and how there's opposing political viewpoints that never seem to meet up. But we've been through vast times of political dissension before. I mean, we've been through McCarthyism, we've been through a lot of things that seem worse than this.
Yeah.
What do you think we need to do right now in order to start bringing sides together and making people less atomized and having their own opinion that will never congeal with somebody else, and start seeing something that will bring them to the middle ground somewhere rather than just only consuming news that backs their own viewpoint?
Well, it's a tough question. You're not the only one asking it. A lot of people who have great prominence in American life, either at the academy or in the finance world or in the corporate world or in the working class world for that matter, have come and we've all talked about it. And I've said to some of the leaders of that group, why can't you put together a coalition, Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike, and call it the Coalition for Reason or the Coalition for the Future, and say to these two parties that are so polarized that this will not stand, and keep the pressure on. Newspaper ads, go online, be there constantly. There's not a real eagerness to do that because they worry about political reprisals in some cases. But I think that's the kind of thing that it's going to take, because we're sailing against the winds of an unbelievable amount of money that is being spent on politics now, especially after the Citizens United decision. We're going to spend more than $2 billion next year on the presidential race, to say nothing of all the congressional races. We also have the instrumentation of the internet and its capacity to reach people and mobilize them very quickly, for good or for ill. So I think that there has to be a movement that comes from the bottom up, as it were, but includes people who are at the top. And they have to set aside some of their very narrow personal or professional interests and say, we've got to find some common ground. Whether that'll happen, I don't know. There is a well-organized third-party movement underway on the internet. It's called Elect USA, in which they've qualified for ballots. They're getting, through the Federal Election Commission, they're able to get contributions. And the organizers think that they'll be able to surface a third-party candidate next year that will be a popular choice. It's that kind of thing that would strike some terror in the hearts of the other two parties and maybe bring them to their senses. But in the meantime, it's a knife fight and it's not pretty. Okay.
Well, first of all, I have a comment. And it was about 20 or 25 years ago that I saw you on the Today Show. And you were talking about a vacation that you and your wife Meredith had taken. And you were fording a stream. You had your camera up. Do you remember this? Do you remember telling about this? And you had a perfect shot of her slipping off a rock and going into the water.
Right.
And you said you had a moment of divine intervention and thought, no, don't take the picture, help her to prevent from falling into the thing. And I've remembered that. So congratulations on almost 50 years.
That was a moment in which it could have come unraveled. I was...
My question is, I love our country, and a democracy depends on an educated population. And I see our education being made of sound bites and to come back at people with things that they have heard that supports their position. How do you see people coming together to really discuss their differences without, and having a learned exploration of the issues?
Well, one of the places you can do it is if there's a consensus in the country, we've got to fix the education system. So that's a place where you can pull together disparate parts of any society or any community. They'll have differences about exactly how it ought to be done, but it is a kind of a rallying point. And you have to get community leaders who have the courage to stand up and say, we can't continue to operate this way in which we're so polarized. Two quick stories. One is that I really realized just how desperate circumstances had become. A couple of years ago, I was in Washington at the Capitol, and two button-bright young men came up to me in blue suits and red ties, the kinds of people you see on Capitol Hill, and they were so excited about working there. One said, Mr. Brokaw, we'd like to talk to you about the old days. I think that they meant 1996, by the way, when they said that. And I said, what do you want to know? And one said, I'm a Republican, he's a Democrat, he's my best friend, we go to Georgetown, drink beer, and argue politics every night. They both worked for congressmen. He said, my boss won't talk to his boss, and his boss won't talk to my boss. Was it always like that? So I called over Winston Lord, who had been our ambassador to China, but he'd been Henry Kissinger's policy aide during Watergate. And I said, let's just share with him what it was like. At the end of the day, you'd often have dinner or drink together, reporters and sources in the administration, Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, and you'd kind of chew over where we were and how it was going and how this country would emerge from what was plainly one of the worst constitutional crises we'd ever had. Bob Schieffer told me a very unsettling story recently. He's a great friend, and he does Face the Nation, and we were talking about this. He's been in Washington forever. He said it's never been worse, and he said he had a very senior member of the Senate leadership coming on Face the Nation, and he would be paired with a senior Democrat. And he got a call from the very senior leader's staff saying, there's a green room on these shows where everybody gets together. Before they get together, you say hello, and Bob briefs them, or when I did meet the press, I'd brief them. They get the makeup, we have a cup of coffee, and go out and do the show. This very senior member of the Senate leadership staff called and said, we don't want our guy in the green room with that other one. We don't want them to be together. And Bob said, no way. We're not going to break the rules that we've had in place here for 20 years just to satisfy you. That's very, very unsettling, quite honestly. And we do need to find a way to get beyond that. You know, one of the best starting points for the budget discussion came from Al Simpson, a Republican from Wyoming, and Erskine Bowles, a former chief of staff for Bill Clinton, but they had no congregation behind them. Therefore, it just kind of died, which was a lost opportunity. So people have to, in my judgment, stay true to what they believe, but walk across the aisle and say, we got to fix this in some fashion. And we have a big part in that by putting them on notice when they come around and ask you for your vote or for your check. Then I think you should cross-examine them on when was the last time they worked with somebody across the aisle.
Mr. Brokaw, this is such an honor. I grew up.
Oh, you'll get over the honor in a hurry with me.
I grew up watching you every single night, and I always used to say I didn't trust the news if it didn't come from you.
Thank you.
I have a kind of discrete question for you, and it has to do with student loans. I think there's a lot of discussion right now about the Social Security crisis or Medicare or the deficit in the country, and I actually think the problem is going to be in about 25 years student loans. If my husband and I were to have a child right now, I've estimated that the cost of undergraduate for 4 years, if we paid for everything, would be $500,000. And I know that when you graduate, as we did, and we've got graduate debt, we have no control over the interest rates, we can't discharge in bankruptcy, and we can't refinance. Has there been any discussion? Do you think people are even aware that this is crippling the next group of, the next generation that's going to be paying taxes and paying for Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and all of these programs?
How old are you?
I'm 31.
Uh-huh. Well, you're in that generation, or you're kind of on the leading edge of it, that marketers are now calling neo-frugalist, because you have been so pained by the economic circumstances of getting an education and living in an economy in which there was a great downturn and there were not a lot of good jobs. There is a big trend that probably a lot of you in this room are experiencing. Young people are graduating from college and moving back home, not just in small numbers, but in large numbers. And they're doing it for a variety of reasons. They're doing it for economic reasons because they can't find a job, they can't afford housing in the urban areas where inflation has taken hold. They're also doing it, however, because they don't trust the institutions or the corporations anymore. They believe in their families. I think one of the things that we have to do with education is look at the cost of it and the inefficiency of the enormous cost. Even state public universities cost a lot of money. And the marketplace is already at work on that. A lot of young people are going to community colleges, which are more affordable, give them a skill set often so they can go out and get a job, but then if they want a four-year degree in literature or humanities, they can go back and find another way. I write in the book about the desperate need of the public university system to have consolidation of administration and services and construction costs. So you're not spending all of that money on the superstructure of education, the overhead that comes with it. But the academy has occupied a kind of privileged place in our lives for a long time. It's very hard for them to make those adjustments. I was honored by the State College Association a couple of years ago because I went to a small public university. And it was right at the beginning of the downturn. And I told them pretty much in harsh terms, what was coming. That I thought that we were going to have pretty high unemployment, that this credit crisis was going to race through our system, and that not much would be done in the States. And when I finished, one of the presidents raised his hand and said, "You think it'll have any effect on us?" Because they had felt so insulated from it. And they've got to get real about it. And they'll get real if more people turn to online education, for example, like the University of Phoenix, or they go to community colleges. That competition will begin to drive some efficiencies, I think, in the higher education system. Places like Harvard will always be elite and always be expensive, and we hope that the endowment comes back enough to provide the money for the people who truly deserve it. But it's a tough calculation. 10% of the students graduating from college now with student loans have debt of $40,000 after 4 years of college. That's an enormous weight to carry out, especially into an economy in which there are no jobs. I don't have an easy answer, but that's the best I can do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Brokaw. Over the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen news organizations get snapped up by media conglomerates. And I was wondering how you could talk about how that's affected the newsrooms for you, and any challenges that have come up, and what you think journalism needs to do in the future to sort of combat that conglomeration of media, and how it sort of constricts good journalism.
Well, young people want to study, you talk about journalism, and young people want to study journalism come up to me a lot, and I say, look, you got to remember I started in the Stone Age. I didn't have a lot of application, but I'm active in the internet age enough to know. And I say, first of all, you got to understand how the internet works, and most young people are very dexterous when it comes to that. They're at ease on it. And then my second piece of advice always, in terms of what tools are you looking for, learn to write. Because whatever the form that we get our news in, it has to be expressed in a coherent fashion. And writing will not go out of fashion. Even when you're texting, we'll get beyond that when you're writing long, more complicated stories. But what I do like about it is the kind of richness of the choices that you have and the availability of it, in which you can, on a BlackBerry or on a smartphone as you're walking around, dial into the Globe or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or whatever you want to do. My own guess is that there will be a mix for some time. Walter Isaacson, who's written this wonderful book about Steve Jobs, and I were on Meet the Press the other day, and we're longtime friends, and we were talking about not just the boldness of Steve Jobs and the extraordinary way that he changed our lives, but how he had an unerring instinct for how you could put pieces of this new technology together with other people's passions, music going on the iPod and so on. But then at the end of the conversation, Walter said something interesting I hadn't thought about in the same way. He said, I don't want to ever give up paper, because 25 years from now, the books that are important to me, I know they'll be there on paper. I'm not sure I'll be able to find the books that I'm buying electronically. How am I going to store them? Where are they going to be? I love the magic of paper. And I think there are a lot of people who want that tactile experience and will for some time. My granddaughters, who are voracious readers, the San Francisco granddaughters, because they're old enough to do that, they're never without a book in their hand. Never without a traditional book in their hand. Harry Potter came along and it was astonishing to me. I mean, they read every one of them 3 times. Those were big, deep books, and they'd stand in line at the bookstore at midnight to make sure that they got the next one. That's kind of heartening in a lot of ways. Okay?
Hi. My question is, you were talking earlier about re-enlisting citizens and improving the civilian face of America. And my question is, what role do you see journalists playing in that?
Well, I think that, again, to go back to what I said at the outset, that there's more what we call public policy journalism out there than gets attention, because most people are paying attention to what Hannity did or Rachel Maddow did, or what's Fox News versus MSNBC or one of those. But in fact, the spectrum has spread out a lot, and you can really go to a lot of sites that are organized, not just journalistically, but around interests in terms of public policy. For example, as a reporter, it's easier for me now to quickly find out who's made campaign contributions into what campaigns, because that's all logged on the internet. There are a number of sites that are keeping track of that. That's very helpful. And then we can put it into a wider format, either electronically or on print. So it's a matter of using these tools effectively. I say to young audiences that the internet and all of its capabilities and capacity really is a tool. It's an extension of your head and your heart, and you have to decide how you can use it effectively. So that's the important thing. Last question.
Mr. Brokaw, good evening. My name is Louis Navia. I'm here an undergraduate at the Harvard University. You touched a little bit about the American dream and the sacrifices your family and the sacrifices you've made. I myself, I'm part of that American dream. My parents are immigrants from Colombia, and I came here, worked hard, made the sacrifices that I needed to do. With the movement of Occupy Wall Street, their lack of demands, their lack of structure, and their lack of leadership, quote unquote, they have the masses, but I feel like they are requiring kind of like a handout. One of the things that I've noticed through my research of history is that pre-1950, our parents and our grandparents and that generation were hard workers, physical hard workers, and they understood the value of a dollar. Post-1990, the generation that's coming up is starting to understand hard work. The thing that happened in the great generation that you spoke about, the baby boomers, my parents, is that all of a sudden they want instant gratification for the less work, the more reward, no short-term gain, long-term sacrifice. Where do you see the education system, the policies, the media? Because I myself I'm an entrepreneur. I own 2 companies co-founded with this gentleman here, and we're creating jobs. We don't want jobs. We want to create them. We want to create the change. We want to create innovation. We want to create movement. We want to create inspiration. And we want to take the youth and empower them with this. But we see that generations, your generation, our parents' generation, are telling us no. You know, there's part of them that do inspire us, but our politicians, our CEOs, our corporate leaders right now trump us because they're afraid of the innovation and the change that we're going to bring. How do you expect our generation to arm ourselves, aside from knowledge and information, to be able to promote this change and innovation that's coming?
I think you're doing pretty well, frankly. If you look at Silicon Valley, I mean, there you are. You've got 2 companies already. You know, my generation went to work for IBM and expected to be a lifer, for example, or went to work for one of the big corporations. I've worked for NBC for 45 years, one company. And you go to Silicon Valley or a lot of the other startup places in America, young people are out there building businesses every day and coming up with new ideas to invent what they have. I really thought you were going to get into the H-1B visa problem, where we need to keep the best talent that wants to stay here once they come here and get educated.
And the DREAM Act, you know, the policies that we have, all these geniuses being educated in America, because our American institutions are the best of educations worldwide, right. Especially here in Cambridge. We are the mecca of education. They're leaving. We're leaving our country to go back to their country because their prosperity, because the policies, because the development, those aspects are coming back. And why haven't we seen the DREAM Act being passed at a national level when there are states passing them?
Huge blind spot. And at the corporate level in America, they're tearing their hair out because they want to get the best people to stay with them, especially in this now post-industrial world in which we live, in which you've got to have a whole different skill set. And there just has not been much response to it. I went out to Silicon Valley to do a story just about that. And there was a young software developer he was from England, a very successful company, but he had only a temporary visa and he needed to get an H-1B renewed. So the immigration people came to see him because they wanted to see the warehouses where he was storing his software. And he said, how do you begin with that? I mean, if they don't understand. So we do have a lot of work to do. And election years are times in which we should have those discussions, and we're all going to have to take part. We just can't, lower our heads and wring our hands. I'll leave you with one final kind of metaphorical answer to all of this, that it circles back to being a grandparent and having grandchildren. In fact, the woman who asked me about the time that I recalled on the Today Show having my wife stranded in the middle of a flooded stream is representative of how we've lived a lot of our lives. We love the outdoors. We spent a lot of time backpacking and climbing in wilderness areas all over the world. So we couldn't wait to introduce our granddaughters to this. They came to Montana as they do every summer, and when they got to be 7 and 5, the two oldest ones, we said, okay, it's time for your first overnight camping trip. And we're going to go to this backcountry cabin. It's really a cowboy shack in the backcountry of our ranch where they stayed during the roundup time. There were no trails to this particular place that we were going. It was up a pretty steep slope and then down through a rocky cliff, and then we finally could see the cabin off in the distance. And we made a fire and cooked an evening meal, and the girls were kind of wide-eyed and a little bit skeptical about all this. And Meredith and I had carried in the sleeping bags, but they had their own backpacks. And we said, you're going to spend the night in this cabin, which is a small, tiny cabin, just room for kind of 2 people. No lights or anything like that. We had the little headlamps for them. And we'll be right outside. Meredith and I will be sleeping on the ground in our sleeping bags. And they call my wife Nan, as I said earlier. And the sky gets dark, stars come out. We show them that. They go in and get tucked in. Meredith and I are in our sleeping bags, and I said to Meredith, you hear that? And there was a big buzz going on in the cabin. They were talking, whispering back and forth. Then all of a sudden, the youngest of the 2, we could hear her feet hit the floor and come stomping out of the cabin, stand on the porch over the 2 of us in our sleeping bags and say to her grandmother, Nan, Nan, we need an adult in here now. That's kind of where I think the country is, quite honestly. Thank you all very much.